My name is Jack Cole, and I'm retired from the New Jersey State Police, where I spent 26 years. 14 of those years I worked in narcotics, basically undercover. I spent a lot of time at first working on young people on the streets who were smoking pot and dipping and dabbing in drugs. And then later, as the problem grew worse and worse and worse, I actually was working billion-dollar international heroin and cocaine rings. And I was certainly there long enough to see the horrors that we have created in the United States with our policy of a war on drugs. Everything is perhaps about 1,000 times worse than it was in 1970 when our president, or the man running for president, Richard Milhouse Nixon, declared war on drugs. It was his idea, and it had absolutely nothing to do with drugs. It had mainly to do with the fact that he was running for the presidency for the second time, and he thought this time it'd really be nice if he could win. So he knew if he was a strong anti-crime guy, it'd bring him a lot of votes. But boy, if he could be in charge of a war, how those votes would pour in. And it did work, after all. He was elected. And in his first year in office, he managed to get the U.S. Congress to pass massive funding bills to give money to any police department willing to hire officers to fight his war on drugs. Give you an idea how huge these things were. When I joined the New Jersey State Police in 1964, we had 1,700 troopers, and we had a 7-man narcotic unit. Just 7. Always seemed perfectly adequate for the job we needed to do then. And 6 years later, we had exactly those same numbers until October of 1970, when, thanks to these funding bills of Mr. Nixon's, we went from a 7-man narcotic unit to a 76-person bureau overnight in one step, all paid for by the federal government. Now, you know, when you increase the size of a police organization that only has one job, arrest drug offenders, you increase that by 11 times its size, you set up a great deal of expectation in the coming years. The next year, we were expected to arrest 11 times more drug offenders than we did the year before. And this was replicated across the entire United States. So we were off and running. We were literally in a race to justify this money that was spent. And we were arresting almost anybody in sight and charging them as drug dealers.
It sounds to me like you are somewhat critical of this policy. Just to be absolutely sure, back in those days, you were a dedicated police officer. You were dedicated to this, fighting this war.
Absolutely. I'm still a dedicated person. I'm retired now, but I'm certainly dedicated to the role of policing. It's not the police who are at fault here. It is the politicians who created prohibition of drugs.
It appears that you have somehow changed your viewpoint on this problem.
Oh, certainly.
What happened? What made you change your mind?
Well, after 3 years of living undercover in the streets with these people who were drug users, I discovered that they weren't the people that I had been taught they were. We had been taught that they were almost demonic. When I went out there, I thought they might have horns growing out of their hands, you know. These were supposedly the worst people on earth. And after 3 years of living out there with them, I discovered that they're no different than I am. They have the same wants, the same needs. They want respect, they want a decent job, they want food for their family and everything else. The only thing that separates them from me is they want to put something in their body that I don't want to put in my body. And look at the stuff I put in my body. I drink straight bourbon whiskey, you know, one of the worst drugs known to human beings. But that's a legal drug, so I'm okay.
But what happened to make you, was there any particular event or any incident that made you realize that maybe...
Certainly was. Certainly. What made me realize that this problem was not the problem that the police say it is, but it was the problem of prohibition itself, was actually working on it and seeing that no matter what we did, things got worse. Every year it got worse than it was the year before. And each successive year we threw more money at it, hired more police officers, made harsher laws, mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes you're outlaw, put these people in jail for life. Nothing worked. When I was a young trooper in 1970, at the start of the war, we considered an ounce, 28 grams of cocaine or maybe 7 grams of heroin, a large seizure. That was a large drug seizure. What do we get today? We get individual seizures of 10 tons of heroin, 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure each. And nothing changes on the street, except drugs keep getting cheaper, more potent, and far easier for our children to access. Now that's a failed policy, any way you look at it. So when I retired, I felt so bad about my part in implementing what today I consider not only a failed war on drugs, but far worse than that, it is a self-perpetuating and constantly expanding policy disaster. So I sat down with 4 other police officers, and we created this organization, LEAP, which stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. Today, we have 20,000 members. We're not just cops anymore. We're police, we're judges, we're prosecutors, we're prison wardens. We even have DEA and FBI agents. And we're all calling for an end to the war on drugs. We want to legalize and regulate all drugs. And the reason we want to do it is because we look at this from the viewpoint of law enforcement, and we know, for instance, we did this once. We had alcohol prohibition in the United States. Only lasted 13 years because we were smart enough to realize that alcohol prohibition created organized crime. It created the highest rate of murder in the history of the United States to that point, and the highest rate of corruption of public officials and police officers to that point in the United States. And we know that the day we ended that nasty law in 1933, the next morning, Al Capone and all his smuggling buddies, they were out of business. They were off our streets. They were no longer out there killing each other to control that very lucrative market. They were no longer killing us cops, charged with fighting that useless war. And they were no longer killing our children who were caught in crossfire and drive-by shootings, all the things we experience today. So we know that if we legalize these drugs, we can completely remove the violence. And then if we regulate them, we can get a lot of other good things. For instance, we can end overdose deaths.
Won't you think that these realizations would also be accessible to, well, a number of politicians or decision makers? But yet it somehow seems very hard to find any politician to stand on this platform.
Not anymore. Not anymore, it's not. You were right, it used to be. But thanks to us, we've been around 7 years now. We've made 5,500 presentations. We're strictly a speakers bureau. We have 80 speakers now. Anybody can join us. But in order to be a speaker or board member, you have to be current or former law enforcement. That's where we get our credibility. And it's because of that credibility, it's because a cop is telling you we've got to end this thing. People that actually fought the war are telling you it's a disaster. People listen to us. In those 5,500 presentations, and we don't go out speaking to a bunch of people that want to use drugs. We speak to very conservative people usually. We speak to civic and professional organizations, religious and educational organizations, speak to things like Rotaries, Kiwanis clubs, Lions clubs, chambers of commerce. These are very conservative groups, but political organizations. And we find that after we've talked to them, 80% of them agree with us, 80% of them. When we walk in the door, probably not 5%. But after they hear what we have to say, 80% agree with us.
So there is a change going on in America.
There's tremendous change going on. And you know what you said about politicians. Politicians are now getting on board on this. We have, our state legislators. Of course, we got 50 states, and each state has their state legislators. And they have a thing called the caucus of black state legislators, African American folks. About 3 years ago, that caucus came together and passed a resolution calling for an end to the war on drugs. treat drug abuse as a health problem. That's all we want. Treat it as a health problem, not a crime problem. A year later, the National Caucus of Latino state legislators passed the same resolution. And a year after that, 225 mayors from the largest cities in the United States came together at the National Mayors Conference, and they passed the same resolution unanimously. End the war on drugs. Treat drug abuse as a health problem. So you see, politicians are coming around. They are understanding.
One could also maybe think that the change in government in the United States, the change in administration, the new Obama administration maybe have a different look on these things.
Not likely. No, we'll have to force the issue. Every president since Nixon, who was a Republican, but every president since him, whether Republican or Democrat, has made the situation worse than it was when they went into office. So it's a completely nonpartisan disaster.
But what is the power that drives them to do this? I mean, why do they keep going down this road? They must know by now, what you know, that this doesn't work.
Think of the money that's behind this. There's tremendous amounts of money involved in this. Excuse me, let me have a little sip of water here. Just think about, I'm not even talking about corruption. Think about how much money is spent Think about how much money is spent by the United States in 1 year to fight the war on drugs. It is $70 billion. That's a lot of money.
70 billion?
That's right. $70 billion is spent, and almost all of that money goes into the coffers of police departments, law enforcement. That's a lot to give up. If you ask any police department, any administrator there, they'll tell you that about 20% of their entire budget can be traced directly back to the war on drugs. Now that's a lot to ask an administrator to give up, right? So
that is going to be a problem, yeah.
Well, we're going to have to force the issue, and the only way we can force the issue is we get a huge grassroots organization, a movement to do this. And we believe the proper movement is LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We want, in the next 2 years, to make this an organization of over 1 million people. And if we do that, then after the next presidential election, right now we're gathering the names of all these politicians that you mentioned that might be on our side, and there's a lot of them. And we're telling them, we're not going to release your name. We're going to hold on to it, but in 2 years, we're going to come back to you with such a huge organization that we can show you, you won't lose one more vote than you gain if you support these policies of ending drug prohibition. And if we show them that, I think they will end this thing, because it is an absolute disaster. And we know from looking around the world that if we legalize and regulate drugs, we can reduce death, disease, crime, and drug addiction. Because there's other countries where they've leaned, every other country where they've even leaned toward ending some of the repression of the drug laws, everything has gotten better after they've done it. Are you aware of what happened in Portugal? That Portugal decriminalized all drugs, right? In July of 2001. That's 8 years ago. Okay, so they got quite a record. And not only did they decriminalize all drugs, but they said you can have up to 10 days supply of your personal choice of drug and nobody's going to arrest you. You'd think that would cause a chaos, but exactly the opposite happened. Drug use for every category of drug went down, save one, which was marijuana, and it only increased slightly. And a study that was just done last May, published last May by Eric Greenwald on this thing, shows that where he compared the 8 years after Portugal decriminalized with the 8 years of all the other European countries that didn't decriminalize, and The other countries where they didn't decriminalize, marijuana use increased by 4 to 5 times the per capita rate it did in Portugal.
The last 40 years.
Especially it dropped with the young people. Young people between the ages of 13 to 15, drug use declined by 25%. For people between the ages of 16 and 18, it's down 22%. Heroin overdose deaths are down 52% since they decriminalized. They're still using that same nasty heroin that they buy on the street that they don't know how much of it is really the drug and how much the cutting agent, which is what kills them, by the way. And that is not a function of the drug, that's a function of prohibition, because when you have prohibition, there's no control or regulation over how it's produced. So we could end all those. But they've cut overdose deaths by 52% because they no longer treat these people as criminals, because they treat them as people with a health problem, and they're not now afraid of taking a friend to a clinic when they're overdosing. So they're saving lives, see?
So the conclusion to all this is that ending prohibition is really the solution to many of these drug problems.
I think it's the only solution. And if people just think seriously about what prohibition means, the drug warriors would tell you prohibition means we're controlling drugs. Well, it's exactly the opposite. It is total lack of control of drugs. The people that control it when you prohibit are the criminals. What happens when you prohibit a drug, any drug? The first thing that happens is you create an underground market for that drug that's instantly filled with criminals. And now, because that drug is dangerous to supply, because it's illegal, you can go to jail for life, you can get killed by cops or other drug dealers. Because of the danger itself, it creates an artificially inflated value for these drugs that is so huge that between where they're grown mainly in developing countries like Colombia or Afghanistan, where they're sold in Europe or the United States, that value can increase by more than 17,000%. Think of what an obscene profit motive that is. The only way to end this is to do away with that profit motive. See, I learned very early on out there living on the streets with those folks, for 14 years I was out there, that if a uniformed cop arrests somebody in your neighborhood for, say, robbery or for rape, the number of robberies, the number of rapes goes down, right? You got the guy. But when I arrested somebody for selling drugs, the number of drug sales didn't change at all. I was simply creating a job opening for hundreds of people more than willing to take the risk for this obscene profit motive. That's why marijuana is a weed. It'll grow anywhere in the world. It's useless, it's worthless, as long as it's legal. But once you prohibit it, marijuana is worth more gram per gram than gold. It's a weed. Heroin, from another weed, from an opium poppy, which will grow anywhere in the world, is practically useless, is worth more than plutonium. Heroin is probably the most expensive commodity on the face of the earth. But if we legalized it, those prices would fall down to nothing. It wouldn't even be worth it for people to sell on the streets.
Where does all this money go now?
$500 billion a year is spent on illegal drugs around the world every year. That money goes mainly into the pockets of drug lords, terrorists, and when I say terrorists, I really mean terrorists. Osama bin Laden made almost all of his money selling heroin out of Afghanistan in the United States, and then he turned those profits around to try to destroy our society. If we legalized these drugs today, tomorrow there wouldn't be a terrorist or a drug lord in the world that'd make a penny.
So one could say that prohibition is really a security risk.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. And it's also a terrible risk for business people. Think $500 billion coming in to an individual or a bunch of individuals. They've got to launder that money. How do they launder it? They create phony businesses. Businesses that don't have to make a profit. Construction companies, hotels, restaurants. How can any honest business person possibly compete with those people? It's impossible. So this is also good for them. It's also good for, we could tax it and actually make revenue off this stuff. We commissioned a study with Harvard University a year ago with a professor, Jeffrey Myron. And we asked him to do a study that would just show us how much money the United States Treasury would realize if we legalized and regulated all drugs and just taxed them at the level of alcohol or tobacco. And he's a very conservative economist, and he came up with a bare minimum of $76.8 billion a year that the U.S. Treasury would realize. You're talking a lot of money. That kind of money, with that kind of money, we could offer health care for everyone. You could pay for the whole thing. But instead, we let all that money go to the drug lords, who don't have to pay a penny of tax. It's just wrong-headed.
So prohibition is a security problem, it's a problem for economy, it's a problem for, well, democratic control of the economy.
And it's certainly a problem for those 1.9 million people that we arrest in the United States every single year for nonviolent drug offenses. Think about what that number is. What do you got, 5.3 million people here in this country? In 3 years, we arrest more people in the United States for nonviolent drug offenses than you have in your entire country. Think of how much harm we're doing to people. And when you arrest somebody and imprison them, and we imprison more people than any country in the world, far more. When you do that, they come out, they have no education, they have no chance of getting a job. The only place they can turn is right back to the drug culture, the very group we say we're trying to save them from. So every year it gets worse than it was the year before. The more people we arrest, the worse it is the next year.
Right. So the cure is actually worse than the original problem. That is what is going on.
Yeah. When you're talking about a war on drugs, the cure is certainly worse than the problem, far worse. We could live with the problem of drug abuse. Nobody at LEAP, by the way, wants to see one additional drug abuser in the world. We spent our entire adult lives, our whole career, working against that. And we haven't changed our mind. We just know that if we legalize and regulate these drugs, we will reduce death, disease, crime, and addiction. What could be better than that? Are you aware of what's going on in Switzerland?
Yeah, they have these heroin
clinics.
Clinics, yeah.
Yeah, they set up 23 heroin clinics as a pilot project 15 years ago because they were tired of arresting their children for making the mistake of using heroin. They said, we're going to treat this as a health problem. Heroin users can go in up to 3 times a day into those clinics and actually inject heroin. They can also take substitute drugs, buprenorphine or methadone. But I'm interested in the ones that shoot the heroin. About 20% of the people in that project have quit using any drug at all. They haven't had a single overdose death there in 15 years because they're shooting up under medical supervision. They're using clean needles. Because they're using clean needles, AIDS and hepatitis, the per capita rate in Switzerland has now dropped that country to the lowest rate of any country in the world or in Europe. That's an amazing success. They're helping, defeat these terrible diseases. Crime was cut by 60%. The heroin is distributed to the users on a sliding scale, but if you have no money, it's free. So that means a heroin user doesn't have to break into your house at night and steal your television set or something to pay for the drugs. So none of those crimes exist. And because the drugs are effectively free, there's no dopers on the streets where these projects are selling heroin, because you can't beat free. Who would buy from you, right? Especially when they can get pure government heroin with no cutting in, and they know what they're taking. So if the dope dealers aren't on the streets selling it, they're not killing each other, cops or kids. So all the violence is gone. And the biggest thing, even more important than that, there was a study that just was done by the very prestigious British medical journal, The Lancet, that shows that over a 10-year period in the capital of Zurich, there has been an 82% decline in new drug users. 82% less new heroin users. And what they attribute that to is they say the dope dealers are no longer in the neighborhoods, rubbing shoulders with our young people to convince them to pick up those drugs and become the next statistic. So a year ago, last month, they had a referendum vote in Switzerland, and they voted to make this a permanent policy throughout the entire country. And why not? They figured out a way to reduce death, disease, crime, and drug addiction. What could be better? And it's the closest thing we have to legalized drugs in the world.